Welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight. I'm Judith Grober, and today I'm here with Bryce Blankenagel. I guess I pronounced that very German.
Very much so. It's pretty rare that I hear the German pronunciation of my name. But you got it. Yes. Beautiful. Thank you.
His website is nakedmormonism.com, and I stumbled on Bryce during an interview that he gave on Myth Vision channel, and I liked it a lot, I have to say. So I thought I'm going to invite this gentleman, and he accepted. Your YouTube channel is Bryce Blankenagel, yeah?
That's correct. I think you can find it by searching Naked Mormonism, but yeah, I think the actual YouTube channel is Bryce Blankenagel. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So this is always my first question. How did you wind up researching Mormonism? Do you have family members? Have you been yourself a Mormon? So how did that start?
So I actually grew up in the church. I am what Mormons call BIC, which is born in the covenant. So I was born to a Mormon family, and basically all of my family are still active members of the church. I grew up in Utah, which is kind of the headquarters, the place everybody knows. It's the Mormon Mecca, right? So that's where I grew up. And in my late teenage years, 15, 16, 17 years old, I just didn't like church very much. I didn't believe in it. So I stopped attending. And that turned out to be one of the best things I could have possibly done. Because as you age in the church, you perform more rituals and do more rites and things that inculcate the system of belief into your mind deeper and deeper, and it becomes more and more challenging to question that belief system. So I got out before a lot of those ritualistic practices were ingrained into my psyche. So after a few years of not really caring much about religion, I began studying various religions, and of course atheism as well, and watching and attending debates between this Christian pastor and this prominent atheist, and that kind of set me down the rabbit hole of an intellectual fascination with religions in general, which I believe is kind of what this YouTube channel is centered around, if I'm not mistaken. So eventually that caused me to turn inward and study, what's my religion? Well, I believed in it my whole life. I don't believe in it now, but what is it really? And from that point forward, I began studying early Mormon history, and I caught the bug, as we say in Mormon history circles, because once you become fascinated with it, it's an endless well from which to draw information and stories and wisdom, and it's appealing and fun to learn. And from that point forward, about age 20 to 21 on, I've been studying Mormon history, and to the point where I started looking for podcasts about Mormon history, and there weren't very many of them. So I decided I was just going to make one. And I started making Naked Mormonism, which is a serialized history of early Mormonism. Episode 1 starts with the birth of Joseph Smith, the founder, and then it progresses chronologically from that point forward. And, this has brought to my attention so many aspects of early Mormonism that I never knew. And it has become an accomplishment and a fulfilling way for me to turn my passion into a living. So yeah, Mormon history is just so much fun. And the best part about it is I find that even people who weren't members or aren't even particularly interested in history in general find aspects of Mormon history to be very interesting. And that provides me the opportunities to be invited onto YouTube channels and to podcasts and whatnot, just like this, where they're like, hey, I got some questions. Let's talk about this. I'm like, hey, a captive audience. I am in there. Let's do this.
Okay. So can you recall that there was a specific situation, an event, or let's say a series of events that you really didn't like, and that was the beginning that you dropped out? Or was it, yeah, well, I'm a teenager, it's just not really cool? And
It's kind of a mix. So there were a few things in it. The very first thing, and in the Mormon sphere, we have what we call a shelf. And when there's something you have a problem with in the church, or there's something you're questioning, the church leaders say, put that on your shelf. And this metaphorical shelf is something that, when we get to heaven, we get to pull all the items off the shelf and ask God all of our most, pressing questions. But for now, we can't possibly know the answers to these questions. So you put them on your shelf. Well, most ex-Mormons, former members of the church, have what they call a shelf crashing moment, where they finally said, oh, it's all my shelf crashed. It was too heavy. There was too many things on it. It could no longer support the weight, and I can't believe in this anymore. Mine was kind of a cascading effect that way. I remember being 11 years old. And as a man in Mormonism, when you hit 12 years old, you gain what's called the priesthood. And the priesthood is something that is not the same to most other religious denominations. The priesthood is basically a rite of passage for young men in the church. I have one older sister who was very distraught and upset by the fact that her younger brother was getting magic powers and that she could never get those magic powers. And that was one of my first shelf items, that it's like, why can't women have the priesthood? Why does she not get it, but I do, just by virtue of turning 12, but she can't have it no matter what she does, no matter how righteous she is, no matter, it didn't matter what she could do, she could never get the priesthood. That was really one of my first things that I was like, that doesn't sit right. That feels wrong deep inside of me. I don't like that. And slowly items like this kind of built up, where there are things that are cultural, there are things that are religious, there are things that are Mormon history related. There are these different categories of issues with the church that I placed up on the shelf. And I'm like, it's something that, I can't know the answer to now, but once I die, everything's going to be cool. And I can ask God face to face all these questions. And some of these things, Mormon history related, if any of the viewers have watched South Park, the TV show South Park, the animated show, they do an episode about Mormonism, and it's all about Mormon history, and it gives a very naturalistic lens of early Mormon history. With a little bit of humor and a little bit of slapstick and comedy, but it's still pretty informative. And that was a big shelf item for me too, because it shows images of, a cartoonized Joseph Smith, burying his face in a hat with a magic rock in it. And that's how he translated the Book of Mormon. And I'm like, that's not how it worked. Well, come to find out, that actually is how it worked. So that's like, well, that just sounds stupid, right? I can't possibly believe in this, because that just sounds like the dude made it up. So it just more and more of these items kind of cascaded, and beginning at that, 11 to 12 years old, when I had that first shelf item of like, why doesn't my sister get the magic powers and why do I get them? Things began to pile on the shelf from that point forward. And then, of course, the more that you learn, the more that you look into this, the more it becomes absurd and reveals itself to be as absurd as it truly is, the more you can't really ignore these issues. And retain an orthodox belief in the church.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit in general. When I look at religions, how they start out, then usually you have one man, and then you have burning bushes, you have caves, mountains, and a lot of things surrounding that entire event. And I always thought, what's up with that? Why not talk to everybody? If you have to something important to say, why is it always one dude? And the possibility that one person alone gets it wrong, I mean, that's really a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And, so
why always one dude, right? Yeah. I totally agree. Why does it have to be that way? Why do we have to have these like esoteric messengers who are the ones who can like deliver scriptures that are like reveal the true mind and will of God? It's like, if this being is all powerful, then just tell everybody, right? Like just talk to everybody, right? It's not that hard, apparently, if you can do anything. So I totally agree with you, and very much it's interesting because early Mormon history provides a case study for many other world religions, because we have so much documentary evidence about the foundations, about the founder himself, about the early Mormon practices and the evolution of those practices, that we can see kind of this trajectory and this legendary path of this early Mormon history and what it has matured into today as being a world religion. And we can use that as basically a blueprint by which to understand how other religions started. How you have one person who is the charismatic leader, who is the ideas person, but is also, is a very polarizing figure, oftentimes has to become a warlord and enforce their theology by sword or by shield, right? And like we see what comes along from those people after those people die, oftentimes an ignominious death, oftentimes assassinated, murdered, or killed by the government, or whatever the case is. Then the person who follows behind them is the businessman, the person who gets everybody in line and stratifies the system of leadership and the hierarchy, and creates a systemic version of this wacky charismatic cult that can then perpetuate for years and years and years, and builds steam to the point that it reaches a critical mass that it will never die out. And Mormonism is recent enough in early history, or in our early American history, that we can see how that happened. We can see the evolution of Mormonism from a charismatic cult, from this one fascinating and polarizing figure, being transferred to his like lower level people after his death, and how they were able to turn it into basically a religious corporation that can survive in perpetuity. And it's fascinating to think of the implications that it provides, and the understanding that we can gain of other religions from that alone.
So I understand that Mormons, they think of themselves as followers of Jesus Christ.
That's correct.
Yeah. So, and I guess most people would agree that the foundation for Christianity is the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I have the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Mormons, that the writings or the doctrines, the teachings of Joseph Smith, how can I say that, more valued than the Bible itself, or that those teachings can overrule what the Bible is saying? Is that just my impression, or?
That is a correct impression, actually, because in Mormon theology, we have the concept of new revelation basically overrides old revelation. So we have the ancient prophets who delivered us the Bible, the Torah, and then add in the New Testament, and and all the writings of Paul, and the letters, and then the Gospels, so on and so forth. You add that in, then you got the Bible. These are the prophets of the ancients that taught us the gospel that Jesus Christ followed when he came here. He fulfilled it, right? The system of Christianity transcends Jesus Christ because it is an overarching plan that is of a cosmological scale. And that's something that Mormonism does. I think more interestingly than a lot of religions, is the theology expands far beyond just a 6,000-year-old earth. It expands to the very foundations and the rules and laws that underpin the entire universe. And we can, kind of dig into that at some point if you would like. But needless to say, because of those things, the newer prophets deliver the newest revelations, the most poignant revelations, and the revelations that we need for our time. So when a new prophet comes along and issues a new revelation, if it conflicts with old revelations or the statements and the writings of the older prophets, that's okay. That just means that is part of the old law, and the new revelation is part of the newest version of the current gospel. So any prophet can get in there and state whatever he wants, because of course it's a he, and that becomes the new doctrine of the church. Now, counterbalance that with the Mormon church itself. The corporate church in Utah is a very conservative organization. It's very orthodox. Nothing that it does is radical, and that means that it's very slow and deliberate to adopt changes. For example, the church fought heavily against the abolition of slavery. It was not in favor of abolishing slavery because Utah was a slave territory. And the Mormons liked having Native American and African American slaves. So they weren't really on board with that. But then 100 years later, the church is opposing miscegenation and the civil rights movements that were going on into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Finally, 1978 comes along, and the church finally allows African Americans into heaven, whereas prior they couldn't even get into Mormon heaven. A new revelation trumped the old revelation that said black people can't get into heaven. The new revelation says that now they it's adaptable. It's nice to have a theology that can move and change and adapt and improvise and overcome with the changing times, but it also means that the old prophets kind of get thrown under the bus whenever the church is, looking bad in PR, right? But no, your intuition, your impression is absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. So how did Joseph Smith manage that? To gather
Yeah.
a follower, to gather followers, and I mean, it really grew into something.
It is. Yeah, and to hearken back to something you said earlier, like Christians believe in the Bible. Mormons believe in the Bible plus. So they adhere to the King James version of the Bible, that they consider that the most correct translation, which it is not, according to biblical scholars. It is not the most correct translation. But they also adhere to the Book of Mormon, which is Joseph Smith's initial project that he was stumbling around in the woods. In my opinion, he was tripping through the woods on psychedelics, and an angel descended and pointed him to where he could find metal plates that were an ancient record of the Israelites who immigrated to America in 600 BCE on boats, and 2500 BCE, for that matter, on wooden submarines. And that was translated from those golden plates into the Book of Mormon. And that's the foundational text of early Mormonism. But of course, as Joseph Smith became a charismatic leader, he became the prophet, seer, and revelator of the church, the mouthpiece of God. That's literally in his, on his job description, the mouthpiece of God. He needed new revelations to direct the day-to-day affairs of his early church. So that's where the third book of Mormon scripture comes into play, called the Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants are Joseph Smith's revelations from the time that he was prophet of the church in the various locations. And he would, for example, when they needed a problem solved, he would write a revelation and he would say that this is coming from God. And some of them are important things, like how Mormon heaven is structured with the various kingdoms of heaven, the celestial, the terrestrial, the telestial kingdom, and then outer darkness and judgment and everything, and then how baptisms for the dead work. So some of those revelations are theological, but almost all of them are administrative. So most of the revelations are Joseph Smith is calling somebody on a mission, or he's sending somebody to go buy a printing press for the church. He's sending people to go do things for him through these revelations while claiming to be the mouthpiece of God. And that is interesting. And you ask, how did Joseph Smith manage? How did he do this? How did he gain a following? Well, the people who read these revelations, they self-select. If they don't believe that Joseph Smith is the mouthpiece of God, they're not going to be a member of his church. If they believe that he's the mouthpiece of God, they're going to believe that those revelations are literally the words of God, and they're going to follow them till their death. So the population of people that follow this guy selects itself to be only the most ardent and stalwart followers of this charismatic figure. And that that really shows kind of the birth of most populist movements, that it selects only the most credulous to keep the system growing.
Hmm. So if I understand correctly, in Mormons' understanding, the process of revelation is an ongoing process. It did not
Yes,
end with the scriptures, and new, let's say, new light or new understanding can be added while we go.
that is correct. And I will also point out that the corporate Mormon church that's in Utah that everybody knows about, that I grew up in, that's the largest sect. They followed Brigham Young after the death of Joseph Smith, and Brigham Young was the tyrant. He was the warlord. He was the businessman who could grow the system and stratify it and organize it to keep it growing. But today there are over 400 different factions of Mormonism that exist or have existed to some extent. And most of those factions have their own prophets, seers, and revelators, right? So the current corporate church follows the prophet Russell M. Nelson right now, who is, I think, just turned 96 years old. Um, but these other factions, these hundreds of other factions, have followed all of their own versions of their prophet, seer, and revelator. And those revelators, those prophets, are responsible for delivering revelations to their following.
Hmm.
So what that leads to is we have the initial doctrine and covenants that Joseph Smith revealed that were his revelations. But then if we go after his death, we have dozens of different versions of the Doctrine and Covenants, because some of those are of religions, of factions of Mormonism that have new revelations every year or every 2 years or every month. And they have to update and revise and add new sections to their version of the Doctrine and Covenants. So the Doctrine and Covenants, the D and C, as it's called, that Mormonism, the corporate Mormonism follows, is vastly different than the D and C that almost all of the other Mormon factions follow. It's really kind of a fascinating way to look at how these religions grow and propagate into different directions, but they all do share that common fertile soil of Joseph Smith and his Doctrine and Covenants.
You know what just struck me? I have to address this. You mentioned a couple of, no, oh, the word is gone, but for BIC, born into the covenant, big.
Yes.
We also have that in the banking system, the big number.
Okay.
Yeah. Then you said GNC. We have that in politics. Then
Certainly, yes.
then you said DOC. So what's going on with all these abbreviations that that certainly resurface somewhere else and in a totally different context? I'm
Well,
sorry to, I'm just wired that way.
no. That's actually a really good point that I want to use to springboard to talk about a bit more of Mormon culture. Is there's an entire jargon that comes with being a member of the church. You're a part of the culture of it, and there is a whole jargon that we use in the community of the church that is completely foreign to people who don't know anything about the culture and the theology, right? So I'll use Mormon phrases that will mean absolutely nothing to anybody else. I'll talk about the Articles of Faith, or the Doctrine and Covenants. Right? We call it the D and C, the Doctrine and Covenants, and we use these as abbreviations. The BOM is the Book of Mormon. The BOA is the Book of Abraham. We have all of these different levels of jargon. And as you continue to grow and develop and are elevated to different levels of leadership in the church, you gain access to more jargon, to more aspects of the theology and aspects of the administrative duties of the church that the lower level membership doesn't have access to, which increases the feeling of exclusivity and elitism for the people who are experiencing those promotions, and also creates a sense of ascendancy. For the lower level people, they want to get to the level where they get their calling and election made sure, they get their second anointing, they get to perform these various ordinances for the dead. They want to aspire to become a better Mormon so that they can learn the deeper mysteries, the deeper secrets of the gospel that only the perfect or the most perfect members of the church have access to. So yeah, and I will also add that using jargon like that is also in a religious context, obviously, is a very much so a signal of cult tendencies, right? And I very much consider Mormonism to be a cult, but indoctrinating people to use a system of language that is specific only to that group of people, that they are only that group of people know what you're talking about, has a way of creating an elitist identity and allowing yourself to be absorbed into that collective identity of that group. So it is at a very fundamental level, it's cult mind control when
Yeah.
religious people are using jargon from their religious identity.
Mm. So in other words, even within the group, the congregation, whatever, there is not one level of knowledge. It's, you have
It goes
to.
up.
Ah,
Yes.
okay. And then it's only revealed to you if you have a certain level.
That's right. So, and the levels are they're very loose levels, but the hierarchy of the church starts at the local leadership, and in the local leadership you have the priesthood, right? And that's like when I turned 12 years old, and my sister didn't get the priesthood, and I did get the priesthood, and she was upset about it. The priesthood is where it all starts. But as you ascend higher ranks, as you age, you gain more keys. And the keys are basically what is termed as your authority in the church. So you start in the priesthood, you start as a deacon. You're 12 years old, you're a deacon. The deacon allows you to pass the sacrament. That's what you get to do with your new keys. You get to pass the sacrament to people. The level above that is teacher, then priest, then elder. Once you become an elder, that's when you get to go to the temple and you get to take out your endowments and you get to perform the magic rituals that allow you to understand the deeper nuances of Mormon theology within the temples. And the temples are not the same as the chapels. So the chapels are where people meet every Sunday. The temples are specific dedicated houses that you have to be granted access to by your local leader in order to go in there and to do and perform the ordinances. Those ordinances include baptisms for the dead, as well as endowments, your own personal endowments, and then endowments for the dead by proxy. All jargon stuff we can get into later if you'd like. But needless to say, when you turn 18, that's when you become an adult in Mormonism and you get access to some of the really, some of the cool stuff. But once you turn 18, that's when the race really begins, because then you go on your mission. And then when you get back from your mission, you have to get married and start having kids, because that's all part of Mormon theology, is the celestial family. You have to bring spirit children to the earth. And you ascend beyond that, you get access to the high priest quorum. The high priest quorum are basically all of the executive and administrative actors within the leadership level. And that stratifies and breaks down into other systems where you have the elders quorum presidency and the young men's presidency. And then at the highest level of the local leadership, you have the bishopric, which is the bishop, his two counselors, and his secretary. And then above him, you have the stake presidency, which is over multiple bishoprics. So the stake presidency is kind of a slightly larger geographic designation, but the stake president is basically head of all of these smaller congregations. And then you have the regional presidency, and then you have the area authorities, and then you have the quorums of the 70s, and then you finally get to the highest levels, which are the quorum of apostles, and then the first presidency. And the first presidency is where we have the prophet, seer, and revelator, Russell M. Nelson, and his two counselors. And then the quorum of the 12 apostles sits directly under the three at the top in the first presidency. And it's pretty well understood that, like, only the prophet knows everything about the universe. Everybody else doesn't get access to those deepest mysteries, but the prophet does. So
And
it's in
that is only
every,
one?
only one man, only one living man at any given time.
Mhm.
Yeah, so then it's obviously creates this system, this very competitive system, especially for the men in the church, that, hey, if I am the best Mormon ever, maybe one day I can become prophet and I can talk to God. So it's a competitive religion. It's a very toxic culture, and very, very patriarchal. But it also creates a system of elitism when you're following the strict tenets of this high demand religion, that I'm better because I'm following the church better than everybody around me. That makes me better than everybody. So it's a very kind of damaging mindset to view the whole world through, but it's also a very effective business strategy. It seems to work really well.
Yeah. Have you ever touched the subject of archons and archontic forces?
I
Archons,
don't I don't
it's
know that.
in the astral realm. You know why I did a lot of shows with Wayne Bush, and recently with Tony Sawyers, we addressed that.
Okay.
And these archons are looshing. Looshing means they're kind of eating, feeding on our emotions. Yeah,
Okay.
these are not in physical form. And the preferred energy is fear. And any energy that is somewhat stressful, chaotic, and so on and so forth. And I'm asking that because all structures of hierarchy are archontic by nature. Yeah,
Okay.
there is no way around that. And another reason why I ask is, you mentioned the angel, a so-called angel showed him the way to the golden
Yes.
tablets. Do you know who Pierre Sabak is?
No, I don't.
Okay, he is an author. He also has a very interesting YouTube channel. I had him on as a guest as well twice now. And he goes very, very deep into etymology. Yeah.
Okay.
And we did one show about, I guess it was snake and a different word, different words in the Bible. And he unraveled it with his knowledge about etymology, which I found really fascinating. So, and he very clearly says that not only the symbolism that comes along with it, but the entire etymology that is around it, that angels are ET races.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And I have to say, I would agree. I don't see angels as these, yeah, usually they are perceived as benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a totally different approach towards that. But I found it interesting because Mormonism there is so much hierarchy in it,
Mm-hmm.
that I thought, yeah, that's another acontic religion.
Fascinating. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to respond to that, just because
Oh.
these are fields of knowledge that you're tapping into that I don't know anything about.
Mm.
But it is definitely an interesting way to kind of view a higher level understanding of how these systems kind of work. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, maybe if you have a lot of time and are a little bit
Yes.
bored, maybe you can dip into that subject and maybe you will find interesting connections.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but okay, going back to Joseph Smith,
Hmm.
knowing, yeah, I mean, you have studied the character. So, would you say that he was an example, a role model of pureness and devout Christian and anything that goes along with it. Would you say he was that?
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question, right? Because if there's the old trope that if you want to hear what's wrong with Christianity, ask any Christian, right?
Mhm.
And they'll tell you that, like, oh, that person isn't a true Christian, this person is, or this is the preferred denomination, whatever the case is, right? And I tend to not really care much about those debates of like what makes a pious Christian a pious Christian, because there's the typical standards that we understand of like Christianity of of well, I mean, I don't know. I hazard to even make general assessments because there's so much fluctuation within various denominations of Christianity all across the world that I'm not even going to try. Regardless, people understand that like a good Christian or a pious Christian is somebody who you wouldn't expect to be, giving into personal vices or having affairs or whatever the case was.
Mhm.
And through those very general, broad brushstroke kind of examples or definitions of what we consider a pious Christian, Joseph Smith flaunted every single one of them. He was a binge drinker. He had a very rampant libido that got him into trouble and eventually got him killed. He was a tyrant. He was a military tyrant and an authoritarian, where he placed himself as the middleman between people and their deity, their conception of God. He had to be the liaison between them and their God. He had to be the person who helped interpret those people's feelings so that he could use it for his own self-aggrandizement. So through all these definitions, he is not somebody who is like who we would typically see as like a good person who we should revere. More importantly, he is an example of what power can do to somebody, how a person can be an average person who does average things, but they get a small dose of power and they get the craving for that power and they can't stop the pursuit of more power, and how much that can structurally disintegrate a person's sense of empathy and their understanding and their any care that they might have for anybody around them. When they have enough power, they don't need any friends. When they have enough power, money replaces everything that they could possibly need. And Joseph Smith fell into this trap extensively throughout his entire career in public ministry. He, like I said, I mean, the guy was a binge drinker. He had an insatiable libido that he fabricated systems of his theology around his own sexual desires in order to justify those within a biblical sense.
And how did he
He,
do that? Excuse me for interrupting, but I need to know how he did that.
Right, and that's a big question, because he slowly evolved these systems, right? So he got caught having multiple affairs, but eventually he had to explain those things away because the people would ask, "Hey, what was that deal with Fanny Alger? Or what was that deal with Eliza Winters? What's going on with these women that we're catching you with?" And he eventually had to create a system, a universal and cosmological theology that incorporates one man having lots and lots of wives in order to justify his own conduct. And it's really weird that we see yet again an example of somebody's own personal beliefs happen to align perfectly with exactly what they want to do at that very moment. So what starts as as a very basic Trinitarian Christian theology, the more times Joseph Smith gets caught with having these affairs, the more he expands his theology to say we're all part of a massive celestial family. We're all spiritual energy. And in order to constitute those spiritual energies into bodily form, into mortal bodies, we have to bring those energies together through celestial copulation in order to organize those spirits and give those spirits mortal bodies that they can then live on the planet. So the spirit exists long before the body. It's not, it's the old Christian myths of, the soul begins at conception, or the soul begins with the baby's first breath after birth, or whatever the case is. I know there's a lot of bickering there. Well, all of our souls exist long, long before our bodies in Mormon
I would
theology.
agree to that, actually.
Yeah.
But
So
I would not use it as a, as a, yeah, let's say, an excuse to have several affairs.
yeah, but that's one thing where it's like, hey, he's the prophet. He can make up whatever he wants to be Mormon theology, and the people are going to believe it. And the people who don't believe it, they're not going to be members of his church anymore, right? And that's back to that self-selection I was talking about earlier, that only the people who really believe it are the people who are sticking around.
Yeah.
And the more that they believe it, the more stuff that Joseph Smith imposed on these people and they went along with, the more he was able to push those boundaries and see how much he could get away with, which eventually led to his assassination, right? Like, you can only do those things for so long and make so many people mad before someone's out to kill you. But needless to say, what starts as affairs needs to be justified theologically, so people can still view Joseph Smith as this pious Christian leader. And that became this concept of the eternal families and all of us being a celestial family, and that men become gods of their own planets. And in order to populate those planets with souls, he must have multiple wives in order to allow for the celestial gestation process to inhabit or to populate all of those planets. Because at the foundation of it, the commandment for polygamy is to multiply and replenish the earth.
And that is how they justify polygamy.
From a theological sense, yes.
Okay. And all the entire cosmos then will be populated with Mormons?
That's the idea. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, the God that made Earth that we're on was the best Mormon on the planet nearest the star Kolob. He was a great Mormon. He was truly an amazing leader, and he did all of his ordinances. He did everything, but he grew up as a human being. And then after his death, he was resurrected, and he ascended the levels of godhood in order to attain planet creation powers. And we understand that the God that created Earth must have multiple wives in order to populate this Earth, right? So, like, me, Bryce, and you, Judith, we may have the same heavenly father, but we may have different heavenly mothers, because our heavenly mothers are sister wives, celestial sister wives. So it's all part of this larger concept, and it introduces some very fascinating questions about godhood and about where all of that came from. Like, God grew up as a little boy, and like, God was a sinning human being before he ascended to godhood, but then he eventually became a god and created this planet. Well, what God created that God, right? Like, what God created Elohim that created Earth. And then you get into the eternal regression of like, well, then if all of these gods are following rules that they can't violate to create their planets in the celestial order of marriage, which is one man and multiple wives, if they're following all these rules, who put those rules in place? Was that a larger god or a system of gods? And these are deep and fascinating and hotly debated questions in Mormon theology.
I was so fascinated right now, I forgot my question. Can you believe that?
It's how I operate. I just talk people into a stupor to where they're just mesmerized on listening to what I say. It's great.
Yeah, but what is okay? Now I remember. What was the name of this god that grew up as a little boy?
Elohim.
Yeah, but the Elohim are an ET race from
I know. I know, and that's consistent with Mormon theology, right?
Mm.
Because Elohim is the God, right? And this is a mistranslation in Joseph Smith's mind. He didn't understand that El was the singular form of God, and that Elohim is pluralization of it. He probably didn't understand the distinction there, or maybe he did, and that's why he called it Elohim, because it's a council of gods. But Elohim is also referred to as the singular deity who created Earth. So there's some disagreement about that. But at the end of the day, Elohim's an alien, right? Like
Yeah.
he grew up on the planet nearest the star Kolob, and he created this
Kolob?
Earth.
Where's that located?
Oh, great question. If you knew the answer to that, then you would be prophetess, seer, and revelator of Mormonism.
Okay. Yeah, but then the religion would collapse.
That's right.
Because it
That's right.
cannot
Yeah,
be that a woman knows that.
that's right. No, Judith, you got to put that question on your shelf.
Mm. Yeah. Or not.
Or not.
So, okay. But yeah. And people buy that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's honestly, it's not that. I mean, it's not like it's crazier than any other religion, right? It's just more modern and more, unique. It has its own its own unique tinge of extremely expansive and at face value ridiculous ideas. But it's not that different than basically any other religion, though. I mean, it's Mormon's special version of ridiculous, but it's
Mhm.
it's just as ridiculous as any other religion.
Yeah. Yeah. But that our God was a little boy on a different planet, and that's I didn't know that
Yeah.
about Mormons. So, in general, what would you say? Is there something like numbers, a statistic that tells the Mormons how many converts there are all over the world?
Yeah.
And so, what do you think makes it attractive
Uh,
to
you
convert?
know, you go just about anywhere here in America, and I don't know if it's as much the case in Germany or elsewhere, but you go anywhere in America and you talk about Mormons, uh, somebody's going to pipe up and say, "Oh, my coworker is Mormon. They're the nicest person I know."
Mm-hmm.
And the church, the corporate church of Utah, has invested so much time, decades of time, into creating the culture of Mormonism to be the smiliest religion. Mormons are so happy. They're always smiling. They're always happy to help you with some yard work or to come over and help you move. Or they're Mormons are nice is the greatest marketing campaign that the church has been able to execute effectively. And when you add into that a missionary force of tens of thousands of young adults, people who just turned 18, 19 years old, who
But
are
they are all
going,
boys, yeah?
that's not true. No, so women can also be missionaries. It's just it's more expected of men to go on their mission than it is of women. Usually, for women, if they're going on their mission, it's seen culturally as a secondary option to getting married. If she's able to get married before her mission time, then that's obviously the preferred option for her, culturally speaking, right? So you have this missionary force, and it's full of tens of thousands of these attractive and clean cut and militant seekers of converts who are canvassing the world. I mean, there are missionary programs in something like 160 countries.
Mm.
They are everywhere, and they have the same brand. They look exactly the same. You know a Mormon missionary riding on the bikes. You know them when you see them from across the road. They have built up such a system of notoriety for themselves that they are just the nicest people you're ever going to meet. And they're always clean cut, and they're always well mannered, and they're always softly spoken and kind. Um, that's a reputation that's very hard to uphold, especially when you're sending out 18-year-olds to be your sales force for the church. That's really hard to uphold, but the church has done a good job of doing so. And that alone, that appeal is enough to get people interested, or at least pop the question into their mind of like, oh, I mean, well, why are Mormons so happy? There must be something to it.
Mm.
Then you dig into, what the missionaries present to a prospective convert. And one of the first things they talk about is your family can be together forever. And that's this concept of these celestial families, is if everybody gets to the celestial kingdom, if you're all good Mormons and you're all sealed together, then you're part of the Mormon family. You can be with your family together forever, which obviously leads to missionaries preying on, and prey, P-R-E-Y, preying on vulnerable people. For example, a person just recently lost their spouse in the neighborhood, and the missionaries find out about it. They're going to show up and say, hey, we want to share with you a message about the gospel and how families can be together forever. A person who is in mourning, who is mourning the recent loss of their partner, of their spouse, of their child, of their parent, that's going to be an appealing message, right? So there's a certain appeal to that as well. And add into that the reputation, the Mormons are the nicest people you've ever met, then suddenly things begin to fall into place. Like, oh, there must be something to this. Oh, and they say that I can be with, all I have to do is just get baptized and go through the temple, and then it doesn't matter what happens in this world. Like, I'm with my family in eternity. That's all I have ever wanted. That's all I want in life, is to be with my family. That's a really appealing message. And there are more levels to it, the deeper you get into it. And the missionaries have a very strategic game plan that they follow, an algorithmic formula of what they present at what time, and when they ask for the commitment to get baptized, and when they teach certain aspects of deeper theology and little bits about Mormon history. It's tailored to be an easy to walk path right into getting baptized into the church. And then you find out about the stuff that we're discussing here today after you've been in for a few years. And you're like, oh, wait, holy crap, Joseph Smith had 35 wives. Huh, that's weird. I didn't know that. The missionaries never told me that, but I'm a member of this church and I believe that the gospel is true, so there must be a good reason for it. So I'm just going to put the question about that up on my shelf.
Yeah. The famous shelf.
The shelf. That's right.
So we have a somewhat similar situation with Jehovah's Witnesses, and I can talk to this because my mother's side of the family, a lot of witnesses were there. So yes, the smiling faces, always friendly, helpful, and yeah. Yet, if you are able to have a closer look at the entire, let's say, any congregation, the truth of the matter is, at least that is my experience, I have never seen a group of people where so many really ill, sick people, and I mean that literally, yeah. Sick people were assembled, and also a lot of depression was going on, and that had a lot to do with the religion itself. I bet my head on that.
Yes.
And so that facade crumbles pretty quickly. So did you have an experience where you thought, no, this is the outward image, but it does not fit with what I am experiencing?
Absolutely. I've been on both sides of the equation. Growing up in the church, I've seen the self-destructive tendencies that the religion forces on the people, and the self-preservation tactics people deploy in order to survive in the high demand religion. And I'm glad you bring up Jehovah's Witnesses, because the similarities are stark and disturbing to understand. And Mormonism in some ways is very similar to Jehovah's Witnesses, but also very different. But they do employ a lot of the same tactics.
Yeah.
And one thing you also see in Mormonism is the word of wisdom means that Mormons can't drink coffee, they can't drink alcohol, they can't engage in any of these vices. So what people will sometimes self-medicate with in order to deal with anxiety or to deal with depression, whether that's smoking a cigarette, whether that's drinking a beer with dinner, whatever the case is, Mormons don't even have access to those things to self-medicate. So that forces Mormons to turn to their doctors to get depression and anxiety medications, as well as sleep stimulants and all sorts of things to try and counterbalance the depression and the anxiety that's induced by the high demand religion with just surviving, just getting by. And like I said, I've been on both sides of this equation. I have been in the system, I've been in the high demand system, and I've seen what it takes out of people because I experienced it myself. I had, tumultuous teenage years coming out of the church, dealing with a lot of terrible things and some very dark days when I was coming out of the church as a teenager. And now I am seeing it from the other side of the equation, where I see the causal link from what the religion imposes on the members to how that manifests itself in their insecurities and in creating clinical levels of depression that they need to then seek help for, which then inculcates a deeper sense of unworthiness, because it's like, if I'm doing everything right in the church, I should be the happiest person, right? Everybody I see around me, they're always smiling, they're always happy. What am I doing wrong? How am I not following the gospel well enough to feel the same happiness that all those people are obviously feeling because they're all smiling? It's all of the smiles are fake, and you can't be in a room of people smiling fake smiles for very long without smiling, without feeling out of place. So then you put it on yourself because you feel like you're at fault for not being happy enough, or that you're doing something wrong. And then that fuels even deeper into the depressive cycle. So it's there. Yeah. You see it in Jehovah's Witnesses. You see it in Mormonism. You see it in basically any high demand religion, high demand cult-like religion.
Yeah. And do they also, I mean, Scientology does it, Jehovah's Witnesses, they shun people once they have left or they are disfellowshipped. So do we find similarities there with the Mormons as well?
Certainly. Yep. The Mormon Church has a few tools that they use, right? So with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's called disfellowshipping. The process of disfellowshipping, that's also used in Mormon concepts as well. But disfellowshipping is basically a slap on the wrist, like you did something wrong, you're being disfellowshipped, and you can't do certain things in the church. The next level above disfellowshipping is excommunication. Where you did something, you said something, you engaged in some sinful behavior that was so bad that we have to excommunicate you and strike your name from the rolls. And the only way that you can get back into our good graces is by getting rebaptized into the church. And there's a rich and very dark history associated with how those excommunications promulgated. But needless to say, that creates a system of enforcement on the members, on the local members, that causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of problems in the minds of the followers and the believers. But also it causes the community to help police themselves, because suddenly you're at church and you notice that somebody isn't taking the sacrament, or you notice that somebody got released from their calling, or somebody isn't coming to church anymore. And in these tight-knit Mormon communities, every face in church, everybody there, you at least know their names or their faces. And if somebody isn't there, you notice because especially in Mormon country in Utah, they live 5 houses down from you. and you know that something's going on, that they weren't at church today. So it's like, oh, what did they do? What's going on? And then the gossip machine turns on. So the communities police themselves with these practices. And then within families, especially when somebody is excommunicated or when somebody leaves the church of their own free will, like say they don't believe in it anymore, it's a very common practice to shun those persons. It isn't stratified in Mormonism the way it is with Jehovah's Witnesses and their system of shunning, or with Scientology and suppressive persons. But in Mormonism, we have our own terminology for it. They're apostates. They're anti-Mormons. They're reading anti-Mormon literature. They're led by the adversary, whatever the case is. They have their own terminology, but it's all the same mind control tactics. It's all the same abusive shunning system.
Do they also have this idea that all these, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, they can't wait for Armageddon when everybody will be killed who is not a Jehovah's Witness, and that of course includes then those family members that might have left.
I'll add to that. With Mormon theology, it's actually a step further than waiting for the end times or being excited for Armageddon. Mormons think that they will be playing an integral role in that. So Joseph Smith gave what is famously known as the White Horse Prophecy. The history of it is disputed, but people's belief in it is not disputed. But he essentially said that the Constitution will hang by a thread and that we will have to rescue it. Meaning that the world is going to devolve into anarchy. America as a society will fall, and the Constitution itself will be hanging by a thread. And it's up to us to not only save America, but to save the world. And from most of the people who I've talked to about the concept of what the practical application of that actually looks like is, that's a Mormon theocracy. That's what that is, right? So whereas most Christians are like, the rapture is going to happen, God, Jesus will come back, he'll kill, God will kill all of the non-believers and only the most elect and righteous will remain here. So you better be on good behavior. Mormons say, we're going to build Zion. The Mormons are going to be the ones doing the killing. They're going to be the ones doing the selecting of the most righteous people. So there's I tend to view those perspectives of Armageddon differently when I view most Christian sects versus Mormonism itself, because Mormonism is supposed to be the carpenters of Zion. They are to build the choice land. They are to build the theocracy that will replace the American government when it falls.
Oh, okay. So then they don't have to wait any longer.
Yeah. And needless to say, I'll also add into this. 2012, the American election cycle saw Barack Obama poised against Mitt Romney, who is a prominent Mormon politician. And a lot of people saw 2012 as the moment when the Mormon theocratic rapture will begin, once they get a Mormon elected to be president. It didn't happen, and a lot of people are a lot of very devout, very Orthodox believing, some very radical believing members view 2012 as like the lost year, because that's when Jesus was supposed to come back. That was when we were supposed to start building Zion, with Mitt Romney as president. So some very interesting overall assessments of world politics and American politics that are deeply ingrained into Mormon theology and kind of intertwine and intersect in some dangerous ways, in my opinion.
So Mormons themselves will do the killing of the unrighteous ones?
That's all I can figure.
Okay.
The disciples of Christ will be the ones who are the administrators of the kingdom of God. The early Mormon history and current Mormon theology has examples of what are known as blood atonement, where a person committed a sin that was so bad that not even the atonement itself could pay for whatever sin they did. So the person, in order to pay for their sin, had to be what was called blood atoned, which meant that their throat was slit. And early Utah history has many examples of this happening, where somebody would speak out or somebody would attempt to leave Utah with information or with documents that proved how dangerous Utah was. And then they would be caught up to, and then they would disappear. Presumably, they would be blood atoned for the sin of apostasy. I make content that is critical of Mormonism. I would be one of the first people on the chopping block, because I'm not just an apostate, I'm a vocal anti-Mormon apostate.
Okay, and do they have special forces for people like you?
They did, but there's nothing to prove that those forces exist today. But there's also nothing that shows that those forces that were created in the 1840s and 50s were ever dissolved officially. So it's just kind of a matter of conjecture.
Okay. I will. So this Zion that you talked about, will that be erected here on Earth in 3D, or is that a celestial thing, or is it both?
So one of the things I talked about earlier are, the jargon that Mormons use. One of those things is the Articles of Faith. The Articles of Faith are 13 statements written by Joseph Smith that are just that. They're the Articles of Faith, that of 13 descriptions of Mormon theology. And basically every child in primary memorizes these 13 Articles of Faith, and you're tested on these in order to graduate primary. So one of these Articles of Faith, I believe it is the 13th, it says that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, that the earth will be renewed, and it will receive its paradisiacal glory. So it states unequivocally that this Zion, this American Mormon theocracy, will be built on the American continent. It doesn't specify which one, but I think we all know which one, right? And that it's very important to note that that's something that primary kids in Mormonism memorize. And there are many hymns about building Zion, and about the battle hymns for building Zion. Mormonism, it's really interesting. Maybe some viewers have seen recently video clips and pictures from the terrorist riot that happened at the United States Capitol 2 weeks ago. And there's currently an open investigation into finding all of the people who participated in this terrorist takeover of the Capitol.
That was staged. I mean, we have all the proof is in. It was CNN was there. They planted them, and then BLM Antifa was there holding up a Trump sign. So yeah.
According to everybody, right? According to everybody, it was all staged. It was all a leftist takeover instead of a rightist takeover. And we can argue and bicker about the causes of it and how it all came to be and who's responsible for it. Needless to say, there is one person who was there that the people who are trying to track down all of the participants in it and arrest them. They put out this notice. They're trying to find this person who was dressed up as Herod. This man wasn't dressed up as Herod. He was dressed up as Captain Moroni. And Captain Moroni is a Book of Mormon figure. So in
what
the
does
Book of
that
Mormon,
look like, dressed like Moroni?
Let me find it really quick. Yeah, so I'm going to find this really quickly. I'm going to share my image or share my screen so you can see what this actually looked like. This is the guy right here. He was part of the people who stormed the Capitol, but this is him. And they've, the FBI has said that he's dressed up to look like Herod. But he's actually dressed up to look like a prominent Mormon figure. And if I can find it, there's also the picture of him holding up a flag that has some writing on it. I mean, in this image, he has the flagpole, but the image includes that scrap of cloth. He has written on it a passage from the Book of Mormon that this Captain Moroni held up that was called the Title of Liberty. And it's something to the effect of, for our families, for our religion, for our lives, so on and so forth, whatever. But this is in the Book of Mormon. Moroni is actually a military general, and he is, for all intents and purposes, he's the Hitler of the Book of Mormon. He murders 4,000 women and children to make an example and to teach the Lamanites a lesson, basically. He captures prisoners of war and forces them to dig their own mass graves before genociding and killing all of them. He kills political dissenters. He's a terrible military tactician. He's really bad at sieging cities, which if you're a military leader and you're trying to take enemy strongholds, he's really bad at it. But needless to say, he's this figure in Mormon culture who is held up as like a bastion of liberty and a bastion of righteousness, because he was a prophet, military leader, and king, basically. So this man is dressed up as Captain Moroni, storming the Capitol, because he truly believes in his heart of hearts that he's going to be one of the people who's going to rescue the Constitution as it hangs by a thread. These aren't benign beliefs. These are radical, revolutionary, theocratic beliefs that Mormons dream about the day that Zion, the New Jerusalem, that their Mormon theocracy is built on the ruins of America after the nation is overthrown and anarchy takes hold. Mormonism will be the Catholicism of the Western Roman Empire. It's dangerous. Those are dangerous beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, true anarchy has nothing to do with lawlessness and rioting in the street.
So I use anarchy in a colloquial sense, yes, and I agree with you. Right? There's the system that they're looking at, like nuclear war will break out, all of the world's governments will crumble. Then we're going to start by building building Zion on the American continent, and then we'll use that as the stronghold to perpetuate the Mormon theocracy through the rest of the world to build an entire world utopia of Mormon theocracy.
That was my next question, that from there they are spreading.
That's right.
And let's say, I don't know if there is material out there that talks about it, but let's say other countries do not want to have that Mormon theocracy.
Luckily, we got a General Moroni for just that instance.
Oh, okay. So they would then declare war to other countries?
Yeah, because those countries are obviously, if they don't want to become a Mormon theocracy, then those countries are apostate. They are led by the adversary. Then they are therefore, and I'm going to use more Mormon jargon here, they are therefore good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden underfoot.
Yeah, that's an interesting worldview.
Yeah. It very much so is.
And I say interesting so that I'm not going to say very distorted and twisted.
I prefer dangerous because it really, really is. Mormons may be the nicest people you've ever met, but at the end of the day, the theology in which they believe, they are programmed sleeper cells, right? If the Mormon prophet gets up and tells people that that Zion is being built, that it is time to take true action, they're going to do whatever he says. And Mormons are also they're hoarders of food stores, right? So it's pretty deep within Mormon culture to have an extensive system of food storage. And most Mormon families have their basements full of food, which is not the case for most Americans. Most Americans buy the food that they need. They don't have a 5-year supply of raw grain the way that Mormons do. And Mormons also have tons of guns, right? Mormons love their guns. I was one of them, and I still own guns. I'm just not as like steeped in the culture of it as when I was a Mormon. But Mormons have a lot of guns. They have a lot of supplies. They have a geographically isolated state and area and part of the country that they could create a stronghold. All they're waiting for is a signal from their prophet to tell them to act, and they will do whatever he says. And when you have a swath of land that is, inhabited by 3 million people who are militant theocrats, that is dangerous. That is terrifying to me, because that's how revolutions start.
Yeah. So there's also one thing, celestial marriage.
Yes.
And so from what I could gather, it says that you can be married forever and ever in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened to until death do us part?
Yeah, there are statements from early church leaders saying that like the greatest scourge on society is the phrase "till death do us part," because that's not how Mormons believe it to be. Marriage is forever in Mormonism.
But even Jesus said that.
Yeah, Mormons really don't care much about what Jesus said. They care about what modern prophets say. Hey, it's that old, new prophecy trumps old prophecy and old scripture. So what Joseph said is a lot more important than what Jesus ever said. Most Mormons aren't biblical scholars either. Mormons read their Bible less than I would say than some Christians. I don't know. There's a lot of variability in that. Mormons do read their Book of Mormon a lot more than Christians read their Bible.
Okay. Yeah. So, when you talked about this little boy that grew up on a planet somewhere and and then became God, and that reminds me a little bit of Scientology.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, because God's an alien, right? We're all spiritual energy that this God alien constituted into a singular form and then transferred into our physical bodies when we were born. So there's the celestial copulation that takes raw energy and organizes it into spiritual energy. And then there's the physical copulation that happens on the planet that takes that spiritual energy and unites it with a mortal body. And then only throughout the plan of salvation, the plan of happiness, as it's called, or the POS, the plan of salvation in Mormon theology, are those the spiritual energy and the body are disintegrated. The tie between them is disintegrated at death. The spirit goes to paradise or prison. The body goes into the ground. The resurrection happens, and those forces are once again united, and we are resurrected as perfected, physical, human-bodied celestial beings. Unless you're really bad, like me, and you're an apostate and you speak out against the church, then in that case, I go to outer darkness. And we don't know a lot about outer darkness, but some early Mormon theologians, including Orson Pratt, talked extensively about spiritual disintegration or spiritual dissolution, where the celestial copulation that happens in order to organize raw energy into spiritual energy to prepare it for a body, that process is essentially reversed, where the organization of that spiritual energy is disorganized into raw energy, and that it takes the process of another God couple copulating in order to reorganize that raw energy back into a spiritually constituted being that can then be born onto another planet. So in that sense, Mormon theology believes also in reincarnation.
And where is this God couple now coming from? I was under the impression that women do not have a lot of standing there.
Yeah, so that's kind of what the male god has to do in order to populate all of his planets. So there's nothing stating that you only get one planet per one god, because gods, when they achieve high enough ascendancy, they acquire what's known as worlds without end or worlds without number, where that is their entire existence, is creating planets. But they have to have lots of wives in order to populate these planets with spirits. So the god couple is what is done, the celestial copulation to organize the energy is the god couple. But of course, this male god has lots of different heavenly mothers, celestial wives, with which he can copulate to organize all of that celestial energy or all of that raw energy into spiritual energy.
Okay.
I see, that's the thing, is like you look at it as from the outside and you're like, this is off the wall bonkers. But when you understand the totality of it as a completely self-contained system, it's incredibly logical, which is it really counterintuitive because it seems crazy to us. But when you know it, when you live it, when you believe it, there's almost always an answer for every question that takes you to the next level of understanding the mysteries of God. And that has its own level of appeal for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, so in other words, God has wives and he needs wives for creating more souls, and subsequently then they can inhabit Earth here.
More planets, more spirit babies,
the entire cosmos,
more physical babies. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, got it. So now I'm going to share my screen here, and I would like to have your take on this. Can you see that?
Ah, yes. So the person who is, I can't remember if she's on the board or if she's a CEO, is actually a personal friend of mine, Blair Osler. And the Mormon Transhumanist Association basically takes everything that we've talked about of the deeper aspects of Mormon theology and brings them to life in saying that we have to do these things, right? So it's understood that, right, that God will solve all sickness, and during, when the rapture happens, right, like bad things are going to happen to bad people, but all the good people, they will become ascended, they will become perfected human beings, they will become the ultimate version of humans. The Mormon Transhumanist Association basically says, well, we're going to start doing that work right now, and building in the theological foundations in order to incorporate the rapid advance of technology into the system of Mormon theology, right? Because we're fast approaching a time where aging is no longer going to be an issue. And who knows, or like there are some futurologists who believe that the first people who will never physically die are already born right now. They're young children right now who they will never die of old age, that their death will be an elective process, essentially.
To me, that is a dangerous process.
Dangerous or fascinating. I view it as inevitable. Like we're going to get there unless we extinct ourselves, which is, hey, the odds are looking better and better every day for that to happen. We're going to continue advancing our medical technology. We're going to continue advancing AI and human computer integrations, and biochips and everything that we can do to make computers more and more of an ever-present force in our day-to-day lives. The ending conclusion of that, the only real conclusion of that, is the singularity, where we all become computers and computers become us. Like the human consciousness can be downloaded into computer, and computers can basically act as our brains in perpetuity. We can live forever in cyberspace. And I think it's interesting and it's appealing, but there's also a lot of questions of like, what does that mean? Because now humans are playing God, and a lot of people who believe in God, like a white bearded dude in the sky kind of God, think that that's abomination, right? Like that is the greatest affront to God, is to act as a God.
Mm.
Um, Mormonism isn't as averse to this concept. It's very science positive. And surprisingly enough, it's a science positive religion in most regards. They're still not wholly on board with evolution, but they're very much ingrained in like the advances of modern sciences, of medicine, of technology, and they're heavy into investing in modern techniques of investment and whatnot. Needless to say, for a virtually science positive religion to incorporate the concept of the singularity and transhumanism into their theology, that takes a lot of steps. So what the MTA is doing right now is basically trying to lay out the theological groundwork for transhumanist belief within the framework of Mormon theology. Now, of course, most transhumanists are secular. They don't incorporate any belief system into it. It's mostly a secular belief system. And like I'm on board with it too. Like eventually, we're going to become transhuman. We're going to extend beyond the boundaries of these like weak, fleshy meat sacks that we roam around in. We're going to outlive the need for how fast this body disintegrates. I don't want to die. Like I'm among the people who doesn't want to die. I want to live on as long as possible. I want to see what the world is going to bring. I want to see what humanity can accomplish.
You
So
will not die.
transhumanism is an appealing concept. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But
but I mean, this body, yes. But you, the essence of what is you, that does not die.
yeah, and like I'm of the opinion that when we die, that's that the fire has gone out. The consciousness that is
Mhm.
a byproduct of the biophysiological processes of our physical body extinguishes, and it's no longer there. So I don't want the energy that's bouncing around inside of my skull that makes me, the ego that is Bryce Blankenagel. I don't want it to go out. I don't want that fire to go out. If I can give that fire to a vessel that has an infinite fuel source, like a computer that's is never going to run out of energy, hey, please give me that. I want that so bad, because then that means that this body can do whatever it wants. It can degrade. It can become worm food. But what makes Bryce, the energy in here that lives on elsewhere. But there is kind of an appealing way to look at this throughout Mormon theology, and that's kind of what MTA does.
What do you make of the idea that the brain does not produce the consciousness, but is the receiver? That you are actually embedded in a sea of consciousness?
I say that I try and believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And if
Mhm.
there's evidence for that, then hey, I'm interested in learning about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm totally not on board with transhumanist ideas.
Okay.
And I
Hey, you
think,
said it was dangerous. Tell me about that.
yeah, simply because there will come a point where you definitely will lose your humanity. Yeah. What
Okay.
makes you a human? And I have to say, I'm very sorry about this, but there is not one invention here on this earth where that has not been abused and misused. And it could have been, yeah, let's say a blessing, but usually it turns out to be a curse sooner or later. And a lot of those things are, at the end of the day, will be used for total control, meaning I don't want to have anybody, not even an AI. Nobody needs to watch my heart rate. Am I sweating or not? How many hours did I sleep? did I have sex? And if yes, then how many times did I have sex in this week? Did I drink alcohol? And what type of alcohol was that? And I guarantee you that is how it will be used. It will be a total dystopian society, 24/7. You will be watched, and you do not even have the guarantee that the thoughts that you are thinking are your own thoughts, because you have been connected to the hive mind via technology that you are carrying around. And that is what I see coming, and that is why I say I find it dangerous.
So I have a few thoughts on that. If we
Sure.
can continue chasing this rabbit trail. I don't see those things so much as coming as already here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not you drank alcohol and what alcohol you drink, we don't have to monitor your biometrics to know that. We can monitor your credit card. Whether or not you had sex with
I pay
somebody this
usually
week.
cash. I pay everything cash.
Still there's paper trail, and then there's camera of you walking into the store where you purchased it, and you walking out with your bags full of it, and then the timestamp on the receipt, regardless of whether or not your name's on it. Whether or not you had sex with somebody this week or how many times, right? If you have a cell phone on you,
I don't own a cell phone.
Oh, okay. So that's all right. But almost everybody who does, right? Like the location tracking sees where you are, sees how long you're there,
Yeah.
sees how much you're moving while you're at a specific location, or if it's if it's not there, or not moving. So you can infer pretty quickly if two people who are not related or whatever the case is are meeting up for a conjugal visit. Basically, anything that you're afraid of being tracked is already being tracked, and the bad that comes from it, yeah, there's no stopping it.
Oh yes.
There's no like actually stopping it. There's no way to truly fall off the grid. If somebody wants to track you or somebody wants to do something bad to you, they're gonna do it.
Yes,
There's not
but I
much you can
do
do or
not
say to
have to
stop.
play along and get chipped and so-called upgraded.
Yeah, and like that's your prerogative, right? Like that's your choice, that's your prerogative. For me, as soon as there is a Terminator eye that I can take out my biological eye and implant a silicon eye that gives me the ability to like see infrared light or to see things that I am not able to perceive with these terrible human eyes, I'm going to do it, right? And like people get surgeries and get metal knees and metal shoulders and metal hips all the time because augmentation is necessary, because these bodies suck. They didn't evolve to live for as long as we live. These bodies are not designed in such a way that they can live in a healthy way for as long as humans have artificially prolonged their lives. So I really don't see much of a difference between like, taking cold medicine to getting replaced knees, or to getting something like getting like a surgery to remove a cancerous tumor or something. Like there's not a whole lot of difference there.
I see a hell lot of difference there, but
Okay.
it's okay. But what here we have this winged wheel. Yeah, usually one could say, yeah, this stands for speed, progress, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, and here we go again. Here we have it with the Anunnaki from Mesopotamia, and we see it also in other. My goodness, I just went blank. And yeah, then we also have here in Mormonism, we have the beehive, and the beehive is very clearly a Freemason symbol.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it seems, I don't know, is it that it is grabbing from all sorts of religions and belief systems, and it, yeah, came up with a new version of it, or how do you see that?
Yeah. So the way that I try and describe the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, is he was a synthesizer.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to grab small elements from things that surrounded him and incorporate those into his thoughts, his beliefs, his practices, his rituals. Freemasonry obviously was very prevalent in the early 18th, or sorry, late 18th, early 19th century. And he grew up in what was known as kind of the anti-Masonic era of American politics. And a lot of this was in response to Andrew Jackson being elected to president, and various presidents being also very high-ranking and well-known Freemasons. So he grew up in this Masonic panic at the time, because somebody who happened to live, a few towns over from Joseph Smith was in the act of publishing an expose on Masonry, and this man disappeared. He was arrested by a couple of constables who also were Freemasons. And it's generally believed that he either absconded or he fled to Canada, or maybe he was murdered. There really isn't a consensus on what happened to William Morgan. But needless to say, Joseph Smith grew up in the town where this guy passed through on his way north towards Canada, and may have been in lodge at the time when the man was brought there. There's no hard evidence placing Joseph Smith and this guy in the same place at the same time, obviously. But what I'm pointing out, what I'm illustrating, is that Freemasonry was a subject of fascination to Joseph Smith. And of course, Freemasonry incorporates so many symbolisms and so many theologies, and just so many things from such disparate worlds, and then wraps them together in this kind of loosely cobbled together system of rites and rituals and practices. And then of course, with the spreading of the denominations and the various rites and various lodges of Masonry, those things can be expanded, and certain aspects of those belief systems and those ancient mysteries can be highlighted, some can be minimized. Whatever the case is, Masonry, for most intents and purposes, really is a religion. So needless to say, Joseph Smith is fascinated with this. He's also fascinated with what was going on at the time, which was called Egyptomania. Um, Napoleon had stormed into Egypt in 1798, I believe it was. And after the British were able to kick Napoleon out, they remained in Egypt and began their campaign of discovering things and, let's just say, acquiring those things to put into various museums all across Europe, and the United Kingdom, I should say. So this fueled an interest in the Western world in Egypt, because Egypt is like this ancient civilization. It's so interesting. What are their religious practices? What are their conceptions of God? In trying to smash together Egyptian ritualism and their belief systems into the Christian worldview was a very challenging thing. But by damn, if the early Mormons and early Christians in America and in the Western world weren't able to do it, and Joseph Smith was very much a part of this. So he crafted together his system of theology that incorporated elements from Freemasonry and from these various ancient rites and rituals. And who knows where he was able to learn about these things in order to incorporate them, or if they were just slowly synthesized into his religion as it grew and expanded and brought in people into the leadership of various interests and various practices. But like this whole concept of like the magic worldview was very much an integral piece to Joseph Smith's theology. It's kind of a shame that the modern Mormon church is very orthodox, very straight-laced, very boring, because I, for one, find that the Mormonism that tries to emulate these ancient rites and rituals and incorporates the Freemasonic rituals into their endowment, I find that Mormonism way more fascinating than the Mormonism I grew up in. But, You start teaching people about the Anunnaki and about the ancient rites and rituals and about the Mesopotamians and about Abraham going into Egypt and about all of these things. You start teaching people about those, it's going to introduce a whole lot of questions that those people are going to have, and questions create unpredictability, which if you're a corporate church with nest egg of hundreds of billions of dollars, you want to do everything to keep those people coming back and keep those people paying tithing, which means you don't want them to have questions that they can't answer. And the more you dabble into ancient stuff like that, the more questions come up that will never be answered.
Yeah. And then the shelf is not big and no longer big enough.
Exactly. And those people stop paying their tithing, which the corporate church really doesn't want, because best estimates say that they pull in about $7 billion a year from just tax-free tithing money. That nest egg starts to dry up, or that cash cow dries up. Who knows what the church would have to resort to keep that income stream steady.
What do they do with all that money?
That's a great question.
I mean, 7 billion, that's a number.
That's a big number. It's a big, scary number. And last year, actually, just 13, 14 months ago now, there was a whistleblower who actually published a bunch of information from insider documentation about the church's finances, and included in that was basically an overview of their financial portfolio, and it put their amassed wealth, not including their land holdings, which are in the tens of billions already, but just their amassed wealth, mostly in stocks and bonds, was over $124 billion. That alone, and with what the American stock market has done this last year, the coronavirus year, with stimulus packages and how much money billionaires have made, that would put the modern church as the richest single entity in the world. Which is pretty terrifying, right? Mormonism is, Russell M. Nelson, the prophet of the church, is richer than Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, and they do not show up in any statistic,
No,
richest people of the world.
Yep. Richest single entity, richest private entity in the world.
Yeah. It's getting scarier and scarier, I have to say. Now there is a real possibility that we end up with a transhumanist Mormon theocracy. Oh my goodness.
A fun world we find ourselves in, isn't it?
Yeah. Wow. We have been going for quite a while. And I hope you will come back. Because
I had a lot of fun today. Absolutely.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Because a lot of things we didn't talk about that, we didn't touch on that. But I wanted to, I guess not everybody is so well versed in Mormonism. I wanted to give the listeners first broad overview what is going on. And then maybe in another interview, we can go into the nitty-gritty.
That would be a lot of fun. Absolutely. And, you stumbled on me from my interview on Myth Vision. So if anybody wants to get in touch and talk some of these deeper levels of Mormon theology, like you and I have done today, Judith, get in touch with me. I'm all over social media, Naked Mormonism, or, hit the website, nakedmormonismpodcast.com, or me directly, nakedmormonism@gmail.com. But overall, I want to really just extend a thank you to you, Judith, for inviting me and for providing this platform, and for more importantly, for asking the next questions, right? Because it's fun to ask the first question, get an answer, and then move on. But you asked the next questions, which allowed us to really get lost in the weeds in some of these conversations, some of these rabbit trails. And I just had a lot of fun. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you to you as well. And I can't wait for the next session. So guys, that was it. Night Flight for today with the wonderful Bryce Blankenagel. And our links will be below as usual. Have a great time. Stay safe from tyranny and stay sound out there. Bye-bye.